Berlin, January 1933. The winter sky hung low, a dull gray blanket over a nation exhausted by crisis, humiliation, and political paralysis. In the capital, newspapers still smelled of fresh ink as they rolled off the presses, each headline announcing the same event with a mix of triumph, fear, or quiet disbelief. Hitler appointed chancellor. Across Germany, reactions diverged like fault lines. Industrialists and business magnates exchanged cautious optimism, hoping that a strong authoritarian cabinet might stabilize the markets and end the violent clashes between paramilitary groups. Civil servants, worn down by years of political reshuffling, wondered whether this change would finally bring consistency. But others saw something far more ominous. In the headquarters of the Social Democrats, silent dread settled like dust. Newspapers affiliated with the Communist Party were already preparing for the inevitable crackdown. Trade union leaders whispered about contingency plans. Even conservative elites who supported Hitler believed they could control him. They would soon discover how wrong they were. Within hours of taking office, the new chancellor began reshaping the state with a ruthless, strategic patience. He spoke publicly in calm, measured tones, promising national unity, economic revival, and the restoration of German pride. Behind closed doors, however, key allies moved with precision. Hermann Goering tightened his grip on the Prussian police. Joseph Goebbels expanded propaganda operations with unprecedented ambition. Heinrich Himmler, still underestimated by many, quietly positioned the SS for what would soon become its meteoric rise. In Munich, beer halls and Berlin cafes, people debated endlessly. Some claimed that the new chancellor would bring order. Others warned that giving him power was like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline. But no one, not even those within Hitler's inner circle, fully understood the scale of the transformation about to begin. Germany, still fragile and fractured, was stepping into a new era, one that would reshape not only the nation, but the world. February 27, 1933. Cold winds swept through Berlin as flames engulfed the Reichstag building. Smoke curled into the night sky, glowing orange against the darkness. Fire brigades struggled to contain the blaze, while police officers sealed off the area. Within hours, a Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested. His name appeared in every newspaper by morning. But the fire was more than an act of arson. It was an opportunity. Hitler arrived at the scene, his coat still damp from the rain, his face lit by the burning building. His reaction was immediate and theatrical. "This is a sign," he declared, "a sign that the communists are planning to overthrow the government." There was no evidence. There was no uprising. But the atmosphere of fear made people listen. The following day, the Reichstag fire decree was issued. With the stroke of a pen, civil liberties vanished. Freedom of speech suspended. Freedom of assembly revoked. Privacy of correspondence eliminated. Political opponents subject to arrest without trial. SA and police units stormed opposition offices. Printing presses were seized. Thousands of communists and social democrats were arrested overnight. Some disappeared into improvised detention sites that would later evolve into the concentration camp system. The decree was intended to be temporary. It became permanent by effect. Germany's fragile democracy, already weakened by years of crisis, now had its spine broken. Parliament chose fear over freedom. And in the shadows of a burned-out building, the foundations of dictatorship solidified. As smoke lingered over Berlin for days, few realized what the fire truly represented: the beginning of the end for political opposition in Germany. March 1933. The Kroll Opera House, temporarily serving as the Reichstag chamber, stood silent as deputies filed in under the watchful eyes of SA guards. Their presence was not symbolic. They were a warning. The vote that would take place inside would reshape the German state entirely. The Enabling Act. If passed, it would grant Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval, even laws that violated the Constitution. The Weimar Republic would, in effect, cease to function. Inside the chamber, Hitler delivered a carefully crafted speech, calm, solemn, even emotional at moments. He spoke of national unity, the need for decisive leadership, and the promise to respect the rights of the churches and states. But outside, SA troops ensured that intimidation did the talking. Communist deputies, arrested or in hiding. Many Social Democrats, threatened, harassed, or barred from entering. The vote that followed was not free. It was not fair. It was the illusion of legality masking the reality of force. Only the Social Democrats resisted. Their leader, Otto Wels, delivered a courageous final speech defending democracy. His words were met with jeers, threats, and shouts. The result, 441 votes in favor, 94 against. The act passed. Germany's parliamentary democracy did not fall overnight. It was hollowed from within, weakened year by year, crisis by crisis, until the final blow came not from war, but from legislation. Hitler emerged from the chamber to enthusiastic applause from supporters. He had used fear, manipulation, and political fragmentation to position himself as the unquestioned leader of a new order. Within months, political parties dissolved, trade unions were absorbed, state governments lost autonomy, the SS expanded, the Gestapo operated without oversight. The machinery of dictatorship was now operational, and the world had barely begun to understand the consequences. The decade that began with cautious optimism ended in a storm that no European leader had anticipated. When the New York Stock Exchange collapsed in October 1929, many officials in Europe initially dismissed it as a temporary American crisis. But Europe, already fractured by war debts, reparations, inflation scars, and political distrust, was far too fragile to withstand even a distant shock. By early 1930, the American banks that had been propping up the German economy began calling in their short-term loans. German businesses, which relied heavily on foreign credit to survive, found themselves suffocating within months. Factory output plunged. Industrial giants that had symbolized the Weimar recovery closed their doors. Millions of workers were dismissed not gradually, but overnight. Entire neighborhoods in the Ruhr and Berlin shifted from the rhythm of heavy industrial labor to the bleak quiet of unemployment lines. Across Europe, the numbers were terrifying. In Germany alone, unemployment soared from 1.4 million to over 5 million in just 2 years. Britain collapsed under a parallel wave of joblessness. Austria's major banks, already unstable, began to fall one by one, triggering panic withdrawals and the first whispers of continental financial contagion. The psychological toll was just as devastating. Europeans who had endured rationing, inflation, political assassinations, and territorial losses now faced a new enemy: hopelessness. Defeated soldiers of the Great War watched their sons stand in bread lines. Middle-class families sold heirlooms to survive. Young people, raised with the promise of a modern world, stared at a future with no jobs, no stability, and no voice. And in this vacuum of fear, humiliation, and disillusionment, the political extremes began to flourish. Desperation reshaped societies faster than ideology ever can. As unemployment deepened, voters across Europe turned their anger toward the very institutions designed to protect them. In Germany, extremist parties, once fringe actors shouting from beer halls, now surged into the mainstream. The Nazis and the Communists offered different solutions, but promised the same thing: certainty. They spoke with clarity at a time when democratic leaders stuttered. They offered discipline, uniforms, and simple answers at a moment when Parliament delivered nothing but gridlock. Street politics became a new battlefield. Stormtroopers and communist paramilitaries filled the cities, turning every demonstration into a potential riot. The police, overwhelmed and underfunded, lost control of neighborhoods they once dominated. Every skirmish generated new martyrs, new propaganda, new hatred. Meanwhile, Britain faced its own turmoil. The Labour government collapsed under the weight of economic crisis. A national government emerged, but public trust eroded. The pound was forced off the gold standard, shaking global markets further. Across Eastern Europe, fragile democracies slid into authoritarianism. Hungary tightened its grip. Bulgaria suppressed the opposition. Romania drifted toward nationalist fervor. Radicalism was no longer a warning at the horizon, it was the new political climate. The promises of democracy seemed to fade. The promises of extremism grew louder, and the continent inched closer to a point of no return. By 1932, democracy in Europe resembled a cracked mirror, still recognizable, but shattered beneath the surface. Germany became the epicenter of this collapse. Elections were no longer campaigns. They were street battles. The Nazis emerged as the largest party, not through a majority of ideological believers, but by becoming the vessel for Germany's collective rage. Millions voted not for Hitler, but against despair. Inside the Reichstag, democracy died slowly, not through a dramatic coup, but through paralysis. No coalition could govern. No party could compromise. President Hindenburg ruled increasingly by emergency decree, each one eroding the parliamentary system further. The Constitution remained on paper, but in practice, power drifted away from elected representatives. In Italy, Mussolini strengthened his dictatorship, turning the state into a display of totalitarian spectacle. His success inspired other authoritarian movements, proving that a nation could replace democratic uncertainty with rigid control and appear strong doing it. Across Central and Eastern Europe, one democracy after another collapsed under the weight of nationalism, militarism, or economic turmoil. The idea of democracy as a stable modern system began to look naive to millions. Authoritarianism appeared efficient, decisive, energetic. Democracy looked weak, chaotic, and outdated. By early 1933, the direction of Europe was clear. The democratic experiment born after the Great War was failing. A new political age, darker, louder, and far more dangerous, was emerging. And soon, one election in Germany would change the world forever. Clickbait. Video title. Episode 4, Chapters 1-3. How Europe Sleepwalked into Dictatorship. The Crisis. No one stopped thumbnail text. Short, punchy, high contrast. The day democracy died, 1929, 1933. The collapse begins. Video description. Dive into Episode 4 of our WWI mega-series exploring how the Great Depression shattered Europe, fueled radical movements, and pushed entire nations toward authoritarian rule, these 3 chapters unpack the economic chaos, the political extremism, and the democratic breakdown that made World War II almost unavoidable. One by one, the wind swept across the Polish corridor, a cold reminder of the tension that had been building for years. The scenes unfolding in Europe were no longer separate events, but interconnected fractures of a continent drifting toward another storm. Diplomats who had once believed they could keep the peace now watched it unravel in real time. In Berlin, Hitler's ambitions grew bolder. In London and Paris, governments hesitated between confrontation and appeasement. What had once seemed like a manageable crisis was now a rapidly widening fault line, and most officials knew it even if they refused to say it aloud. Across Europe, ordinary citizens sensed the shift. It took Paris. Cafes no longer buzzed with carefree chatter. Conversations turned cautious, quiet, and overshadowed by fear. Newspaper headlines spoke with increasingly urgent tones: rearmament, territorial demands, diplomatic failures. People scanned maps printed on front pages, tracing new borders with trembling fingers. Mothers tried to reassure their children, but even their voices carried uncertainty. The memory of the Great War was still too fresh, too painful, too vivid. No one wanted to believe another conflict was coming, yet the signs grew impossible to ignore. Hitler's demands regarding Danzig and the Polish corridor became a turning point, revealing the fragility of diplomatic efforts. Politicians in London met late into the night, arguing over intelligence reports. Some ministers insisted that Hitler was bluffing, pushing boundaries but not willing to risk another European war. Others believed the opposite, that Germany was preparing for a lightning strike, something far more aggressive than what most governments were prepared to face. Each report arriving from the eastern frontier added more alarm. German troop movements increased. Rail lines carried equipment toward the border. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights expanded, and all the while, Berlin insisted it only sought peaceful resolution. Meanwhile, in Warsaw, the atmosphere grew heavier. Poland stood firm, refusing to compromise its sovereignty, but its military leadership understood the danger better than anyone. Officers studied Germany's newfound blitzkrieg doctrine with growing dread. They calculated numbers, compared equipment, assessed training. None of the results inspired confidence. Still, Poland refused to yield. Honor and national pride outweighed every fear. They had survived partitions, occupations, and centuries of struggle. They wouldn't bend now. Even if the storm was coming, they would face it standing. The British guarantee to Poland briefly lifted morale. Crowds gathered outside government buildings in Warsaw, cheering as newspaper boys shouted the headline. Some believed it meant Europe would finally confront Hitler. Others wondered whether Britain and France truly had the resolve or the speed to act. Yet the guarantee changed the strategic landscape. For the first time, Hitler realized that any attack on Poland might trigger a European-wide war. But instead of deterring him, the pressure seemed to push him further. His speeches became sharper, filled with righteous anger and accusations about the mistreatment of Germans in Danzig. Propaganda machines worked overtime to frame Germany as the victim, preparing the public for what came next. Through the summer of 1939, a strange duality dominated Europe: the outward performance of diplomacy and the silent preparations of war. Foreign ministers held meetings that were reported in the press as productive, while behind closed doors they admitted privately that time was running out. Hitler, meanwhile, created a facade of patience while accelerating his plans. He knew that hesitation among his opponents worked in his favor. Each delay strengthened his position, both militarily and psychologically. Some German generals quietly voiced concerns. They feared an early war would stretch Germany's resources too thin, but Hitler pushed aside their objections, insisting that hesitation invited weakness, and weakness invited defeat. And then came the shock that no intelligence service had fully predicted, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Overnight, Germany and the Soviet Union, two ideologically opposed giants, signed a non-aggression agreement that stunned the world. But the real alarm came from the secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. When the pact became public knowledge, panic rippled through capitals across Europe. Diplomats in Paris and London suddenly faced the grim possibility that Hitler had removed his greatest obstacle to attacking Poland. Without the threat of a two-front war, nothing seemed to restrain him anymore. By late August, tension reached a breaking point. Border incidents increased, most of them staged. German radio broadcasts reported fabricated stories of Polish aggression. The world watched as negotiations collapsed one by one. Even Chamberlain, the architect of appeasement, finally acknowledged that further concessions were impossible. The British people waited anxiously for news each morning, listening to radios with hands clasped tightly. In Berlin, Hitler set the final orders in motion, convinced that speed, decisiveness, and shock would secure Germany's place in Europe. As darkness fell on the last night of August 1939, Europe held its breath. Soldiers on both sides of the border tried to sleep, unsure what the next dawn would bring. Officers studied maps illuminated by dim lamps. Civilians prayed, packed bags, or clung to hope. The uneasy silence of that night marked the final moment before the world changed forever. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. It was the end of the fragile peace and the beginning of something far more catastrophic.